game with you, Dr. Clark? The Give Me Five?
Mm-mm. What is
Oh,
that?
you have to play that. Oh, Monique made it more complicated. So you can blame Dr. Earl Lewis for this version of it now. So
Okay.
it's a little game. Good afternoon, everyone. I see that there are people that have jumped on. So if you will indulge me in this game,
Okay.
so all I do, it's very simple. I will give you a category of something. And in that category, you need to name five things in that category within 10 seconds.
Wow. Free associate. Okay.
Reassociate, yes.
Okay.
Five things in 10 seconds. And here's the catch. You just have to say the words. No ums, uhs, ahs, no fillers.
One word responses.
I mean, it can be more than one word, but just don't say those filler words that we do. I do them all the time. No
All
fillers.
right.
No fillers. Okay,
This is
so
live. We're not editing. We're not censoring this.
no.
Okay. Try not to make a fool out of myself.
It is to allow. I like to ask my guests to do it because it allows us to show that we are just like ordinary people that can have fun.
Okay.
So you ready, Dr. Clark?
I'll go for this ride. Okay.
Okay. So your category is abolitionists. I need you to name five abolitionists. No ums, us, ahs. Go.
Frederick Douglass.
Now you started out with
No. All right. Scratch that. Edit that out. No.
Okay.
Ready?
Wait, I gotta give you a different category.
Retake.
I
Okay.
gotta give you a different category now.
That was an easy one. I was going to knock that out the park, but okay. All right. Let's go.
Okay. Next category. Five HBCUs. Go.
Hampton, Morehouse, Tuskegee, Fisk, FAMU,
Oh, you
North Carolina
way
Central.
over there. That was an easy one. That was too easy for you.
Okay.
At least
Nailed it. Those are the schools I worked in. That's how I know. Okay.
Wait, you worked at FAMU?
Oh, FAMU, no.
Oh, okay. I was gonna
That's
say
the
I
state
didn't
of
know
my
you
mind.
worked at FAMU. You said my alma mater.
Oh, I didn't know you were at a
I'm a
rattler.
rattler all day long. I'm a
I
rattler.
didn't know that. Okay.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I am blessed to have my guest here today, Dr. Sulayman Clark. And as you can see, he is a good sport. He played my game and did it very well. Second category was easy, though. So we gave you that.
Okay.
Dr. Clark is as I'm saying, Dr. Clark is an author. He has done lots of stuff. And as you can see, he rattled those HBCUs off really quickly because he has been a servant leader for many years, working at historically Black colleges and universities, raising money, literally saving institutions, and just really being committed to not only historically Black colleges and universities, but also committed to people of African descent in this country. So I just want you to help me and welcome my guest, Dr. Sulayman Clark. Good afternoon, Dr. Clark.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. So today we're going to talk about your book. So you have this book, The Friends of Freedom, a battle for the heart and soul of America, that you wrote. And I know you've written multiple books, but this book, the beginning blew me out of the water. And so I just want to start, if you will indulge me. I want to start just by reading the beginning, the intro.
Okay.
Okay. Life rarely, if ever, presents us with extended periods of unbroken sunshine. There are many rains, stinging, pelting rains, carried by dark clouds that obscure our vision, challenge our faith, and separate us from the light. Hope can be fragile and often difficult to maintain amidst despair and the apparent victory of evil over good. Yet it has been proven time and time again that divine precipitation blesses those who work and wait. Dr. Clark, when I read that, I needed to read that. Coming off of this last year where it seemed like watching so many people in this country die,
Yeah.
watching a sociopath be at the highest office in this country, and seeing just evil um, thrive.
Yeah.
That was difficult. And then I opened that and read that, and I just,
Good.
yeah.
Good.
So thank you for just writing that.
I wrote it when I was in a space similar to what you're describing.
Mm,
Sometimes the weight of it all makes your knees buckle, but some kind of way you have to stay on your feet and keep swinging.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean that's real. That is real.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to jump into this book because, like
Okay.
I told you, you sent me the first two chapters, and I was like, "Well, wait a minute, I need the whole book." My heart was pounding. I was like, just so like enthralled by the first two chapters, and so I
Yeah.
mean, just let's just start out. Okay, so kind of give us the background of how you went about like writing this book.
Well, the book is technically speaking fiction, but it's what I call fact based fiction. It follows a historical chronological flow, if you will, and it's based on real life events. So the book is really a dramatization and use of my creative imagination to get into what I call phenomenological reality of my characters, meaning how did they think and feel
Got
as
it.
they observe world events and things going on around them.
Mm.
So that was to bring that to light so that contemporary audiences would relate to these historical figures. We feel and think the same things. We react the same way. We do the same kind of injustices. We're all one. And I thought if I could get you inside the heads of these characters, you would make an instantaneous, emotional, not just intellectual, but emotional connection with my characters
And I did.
who
I
experienced some
definitely,
pretty rough reigns in their lives. Yeah.
it definitely happened for
Yeah.
me. So you said factual fiction. Would it be fair to say historical fiction?
Oh, it's definitely historical fiction,
Okay.
but good good historical fiction has to be good history. I
Yes.
mean, you can't have Abraham Lincoln talking to George Washington
Because
because
it ain't.
George Washington died in 1799. So Abe Lincoln wasn't born until what, 1800. So if they had dinner, George Washington didn't have much to say because he was dead. So
Very
you
true.
don't,
Very true.
you don't test the credulity of your audience. You say, okay, that could have happened, that should have happened. Yeah.
Okay.
In most cases in my book, they did happen. It's just that I wasn't party to the conversation. So as a writer, I'm imagining what John said to Paul, but it's based on their own writings. So what I'm saying is not just fanciful writing, it's based on historical fact and actual circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just so for the audience, I'm not asking for a spoiler, but just an
Sure.
overall broad picture. Like, what is the book talking about? So, what's your two sentence pitch about the book?
A two-sentence pitch is that the book um, focuses on free people of color. Free people of color meaning folks who never, most of them never bore the lash of slavery,
Mhm.
but they were intelligent, informed citizen activists, if you will. So I want to bring their reality to my readers. And most importantly, here's my elevator speech. I want to talk about the fact that free people of color were these informed activists. And I want to debunk the whole myth about Black passivity in the face of oppression. And I have four elements of this myth that I want to debunk
Mhm.
in the book, and I try my best to do that, and that's woven throughout the book, beginning to end.
Okay, so then I must have missed something. Who's thinking
Sure.
that Black people was passive during the period of enslavement?
You
Maybe I
know,
didn't know those people.
no, no, no. When I grew up, I guess I was in college when Roots came out.
Mhm. And
Roots was it was, huh?
I said I was 5.
You were 5, okay. No, I was. I'm not gonna tell that lie. I was in I was in college, and like everybody else, I'm riveted to this mini series,
Right.
and I left unsatisfied. Most of you know Roots. know that most of it, if I'm guessing now, I'm speculating that most people who saw Roots don't care to see it twice.
Yeah, I've never
'Cause,
seen it again.
yeah, you got the point, right? You don't need your face pressed in that. So what I left with was an empty feeling. In essence, they were a triumphant family. Yes, they survived the dark days of slavery, but I didn't see them as informed activists pushing against hard on slavery. So when I talk about the myths of slavery, I'm talking about the 5 ways that Black folks push back and resisted. So my book is about Black resistance. That's it in a nutshell, and how and why they pushed back the way that they did.
Okay, so there's 5
So,
ways. What are those 5 ways?
okay, number one, through the slave revolts. We don't talk enough
Mhm.
about the slave revolts. That is a hidden history. And the history of slave revolts goes back to the Stono Rebellion of what, 1739. Most people associate slave revolts with Nat Turner. But that was almost 400 years later. That was 1831. But even going back to the Stono rebellions in South Carolina, that's when you had the first black codes, preventing Black folks from assembling and preventing them from learning how to read and write. So that's a long history of the suppression of Black education. But the slave revolts were real and they're plentiful, and there's a lot of new scholarship about out and about that talks about in detail these slave revolts. The other was the fact that in the face of the suppression of Black education, Blacks tried to pursue literacy and education. And that's where we find the rise of the first Black colleges, et cetera, et cetera. Third is abolition. Most people think of abolitionists as white folks, but there were some very committed, brave, courageous Black abolitionists who led the charge. And I wanted to tell their story. And then most importantly, I want to talk about the Underground Railroad as
Mhm.
a collective enterprise and all that went into it. And I'll just say this on that point. When we were growing up, Ife, even today, if Black History Month, invariably, when somebody says, name somebody who we celebrate in Black History Month, whose name comes up?
Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman is always at the top of the list. And for good reason. She was
Yeah.
arguably one of the bravest of the underground workers, male or female. But what I was saying earlier to you was that Harriet Tubman didn't act alone. She was supported and financed by a whole network of free people of color and white folks who subsidized her trips back and forth over the Mason-Dixon line.
Mhm.
So the Underground Railroad, despite all the legend and lore and romanticism about it, was a collective, well-organized enterprise. And I'm giving a lecture next week about the Underground Railroad as a historical and metaphorical precedent for service learning. That's another story for another time.
Ooh.
But it really led me to a mature understanding. Historians tell us, Harriet Tubman, they speculate, helped about 300 slaves or more escape to freedom. But the truth of the matter is we'll never know the number because everything she did was in secret.
Yeah. Yeah.
And without a lot of fanfare. People like Frederick Douglass got all the applause and the adulation,
Right.
but she was a servant worker working in the shadows and never got the recognition that was due her. But my book talks about the people, the community that surrounded her and made all of that happen.
Wow. And I
Yeah.
know one of the people that is just briefly mentioned in your book is Thomas Garrett. And
One of my favorites, yes.
so and that's jumping forward, but I think this is a good place to kind of talk about him because he was white and he was one of her financiers, right?
Yes, he was one of the most dedicated station masters on the Underground Railroad. Today, if you go to the Amtrak station in Wilmington, Delaware, there's a park. It's called the Garrett Tubman Park, named after Thomas Garrett and Harriet Tubman. And I'll say this much about Garrett, if you allow me. He was a very wealthy man, self-made, did quite well for himself, but he was hardcore abolitionist. He wanted no part of slavery. So the state of Delaware was a slave state, which meant that you could get imprisoned and fined heavily if you aided and abetted runaway slaves. Well, this guy, he didn't care. So they said, okay, we'll fix your little red wagon. So they brought him into court and they charged him gazillions of dollars and bankrupted him. Every nickel that he had to go to paying these fees. So on the day of the trial, of course, it was a kangaroo court. They found him guilty, and so at the end of the trial, he gives this mini sermon in the courtyard right there and then, and he says, "I wrote it down for you. I want you to hear this." In his defense, in his defiance, he says he's a Quaker now. He says, "Friend, I haven't a dollar in the world, but if thee know a fugitive who needs a breakfast, send him to me." It's like gangster, right? It's gangster abolitionist. Right?
Very much so.
Like, I ain't studying you.
So even after that,
That's why he's one of my favorites. Huh?
did he continue to help people even after they bankrupted him?
Oh, it gets better. Um, he continued undaunted, but the creator being the creator, he was restored. He got all his wealth back because he was a hardworking, talented man.
Oh
And
wow.
his community and his friends rallied behind him. You know, relatively short period of time, he back on top of the game. Still being an abolitionist. There's no shame in his game.
But that also says something about this country. I mean, this is a whole other conversation that we can go into later and in another session. But just even the legal system in this country and how this legal system in this country has consistently held up the oppression of people of African descent and held up white supremacy,
Yeah.
and even to the detriment of their own people.
Yeah.
Like, so, if you're white and you have anything to do with the
Yeah.
liberation of African people, it's like, okay, we will destroy you.
We will destroy you.
Yeah.
And now, if you allow me, I wanted to add one little caveat, which is almost like a turning point in the book. So come 1850, prior to 1850, if you or I, black or white, helped runaway slave, that was a matter of moral imperative.
Mm-hmm.
We thought that was the right thing to do, and we helped them in any way that we could make it to Philadelphia and points north of the Mason-Dixon line. But in 1850, the U.S. Congress, with the agreement of President Millard Fillmore, passed a Fugitive Slave Act that said, effective immediately, 1850, anybody caught aiding and abetting a slave was either going to get fined $1,000 for every slave or in prison. Now, $1,000 is a lot of money today. Imagine what $1,000 was back then.
Right.
So if you were fined $2,000, you weren't going to see the light of day. They're sending a very clear message. We're not all you. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. So that was a game changer. So now you got to ask yourself, is it worth it? Dare I incur the risk of helping slaves? And my book talks about the people who say, okay, well, you do what you got to do. We do what we got to do. And we'll see what happens. And they actually defiantly opposed and ignored the Fugitive Slave Act. So Garrett was one of those type of people. Like, yeah, okay.
Okay, so let me tell you, I just looked it up. That's why I was asking the date.
Yeah.
$1,000 in 1850 is the equivalent of $32,394 today.
That's insane, which means I'm going to jail because I don't have 32. I don't have 32,000 sitting in the bank. So I'll say goodbye to you now because I can't pay it.
$32,000.
Yeah.
People were being fined, and they were just still doing this work.
Yeah, that's the point.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that says a lot.
Yeah.
So we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act, but I want to go back to the very beginning.
Okay.
And one of the pieces that is impacting me, and I promise I won't give anything away, but at the beginning you talk, it's Will and Ellen that are at the very beginning. And to me, when I look at their story, it reminds me of just the concept of Black love in this country and just the psychological importance of Black love and couples being together, and despite all the trauma that we may experience in this country. And I'm wondering, when you wrote that piece with William and Ellen, were you thinking about Black love and that being a tool of psychological resilience?
Absolutely. I read their story. They have a book out. It's available through University of Georgia Press. I think it's called Going 2,000 Miles to Freedom. The story that I tell is a real story. This is a husband and wife team. She was fair skinned. He was darker skinned. and they concocted this idea to pose as a master. She was the master,
Uh-huh.
dressed like a male, and
Hmm.
he was the faithful slave who accompanied her. And they made their way from Georgia all the way up to Philadelphia. And the story is fantastic. The sacrifices they made and their commitment to one another had everything to do with Black love. And I tried my best as a creative writer to capture all of that. But if anybody's interested, please read the story of Ellen and William Kravis. It is a lesson in ingenuity and commitment and, God, unparalleled courage. Because
It
there
is.
were setbacks at every turn, every blessed turn. It's like
And that's
you
my
can't
heart
make this stuff
pounding.
up.
I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. So people tell me that after they read the first chapter, they're hooked on the book. I was like, oh my God, these poor people, I'm rooting for them. Like,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
are they going to make it? God, please help them. But
So
but they
that's
made it. Yeah.
that's a story that I did not know about
Yeah.
until I read the book. There's a piece in there where the porter helps them. Is
Yeah.
that part true, or is that creative license on your
Creative license. Creative license.
part? Okay.
Yeah. But what's essential to the story is that they were told that if they could some kind of way make their way north to Philadelphia, there was a man named William Still
There
who
we
would
go.
take care of them, and they would be in safe and competent hands. And that is certainly the spine of the story.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
And it just, so sometimes I think about this, and I think it's because it's February, so it's Black History Month, and there's also Black Love Day, and for people that celebrate Valentine's Day. So it just makes me think about the power of our relationships and the difference from then to now, like where we see higher divorce rates within our community and lots of tension. That and the circumstances are a lot different. So I wonder about that. Like, how did these families, these husbands and wives, stay together in the face of just like persistent terrorism? And that is so different than today, where divorce seems like a kind of it's on the table for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I try to do that, but not in a preachy or a therapeutic kind of way, but through the dialogue, the interplay between the husband and the wife and the children. I try to capture that because originally I thought about writing a book that was essentially a biography of Octavius Cato, the main character. And then it occurred to me that's not really the story. We don't need to be doing any sort of, what do you call that? Hero worship,
okay.
if you will. I wanted to get into the heads and hearts of the people who lived through that oppression and how they did it, because I thought that would be fruitful, useful for contemporary audiences.
Yeah.
And I stayed very close to my primary source materials. I tried to do as little imagination as I could. So I researched their correspondences and things like that.
And if you think about that, and I want to come back to your research and how you got started in just a second, but I
Sure.
want to kind of stay with this idea. Um, oh gosh, you just said something that was good. I lost it just that
That's
quick.
okay.
Oh, okay. So let's just go. Well, it'll come back to me. Let's go to how you first got on this track. So I know you were in
Yeah.
university.
Yeah. So
Okay.
my journey, if you will, in writing this book. Now, this book is like 30 years of intermittent research and writing. It went on and on and on and on. And of course, it was delayed by the fact that I had a full-time job and a family to raise and a very strenuous job at
Yeah.
that. So I could write, at the midnight, burning the midnight oil whenever I could. But the genesis of the book goes something like this. Going back to 1980, I was invited back to my alma mater, Cheney University, because as the story was told to me, they were clearing out an old building, administration building, so it could be renovated. So everything had to go. They were totally gutting it out. And in the midst of this, before the renovation, they were throwing everything into this huge trash dumpster So all miscellaneous trash, old furniture, broken chairs, things like that were all going into this dumpster. Well, in a janitor's closet in that building, there was a stack of papers and about 380 scrapbooks and various files and photographs and memorabilia. And they were indiscriminately, these janitors, throwing this stuff into a dumpster. And one of the janitors was curious and he opened up one of the scrapbooks. And guess what was inside? The scrapbooks were filled with newspaper clippings of events over the last from 1870 to 1902. Um, and most of these newspapers, Ife, were defunct and out of print. But the value of these newspaper clippings was that it gave you a window into the world of the people who lived during that time.
Yeah.
Okay, so come to find out, these 380 scrapbooks and all this other stuff was the life's work. It was the collection of one man, William Dorsey, who we subsequently found out was part of a larger group called the American Negro Historical Society. And these were elderly gentlemen, had seen a lot. Those eyes had seen a lot. And they were self-appointed, if you will, chroniclers of black history. Dorsey was called the main custodian of the collection. So imagine, if you will, all this stuff going into the dumpster. So when the janitor opened it up and he saw there was newspaper, he had the good sense of, wait a minute, maybe this is not trash. So the vice president at the time insisted that they bring all that stuff out of the trash, put all of it in a secure location. We had it appraised. And lo and behold, we had no idea how valuable the information was.
Wow.
So my job was to index and catalog and microfilm. That was the technology then, microfilm, this stuff. And I remember saying to myself then, as I said recently, I've got to write a book about this because young folks in particular need to know about this rich history. And that's where I discovered all the characters for my book. People, Ife, I never even heard of, which is particularly embarrassing because I was born and raised in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know anything about the inner workings of the Underground Railroad and the fact that black people were intricately involved, and Thomas Garrett and Harriet Tubman, who used Philadelphia as a staging ground to go back and forth over the Mason-Dixon line. We didn't know any of that history. Our knowledge of American history or Philadelphia history was the Revolutionary War,
And the bell,
Liberty Bell, and then the Civil War. So we jumped over like 80 years of important history. But that's where democracy, real democracy, was being born, right there in the streets of Philadelphia. Because in Philadelphia was the center of the abolitionist movement, if you will. So Philadelphia was prominent. I mean, that was going on real time. The battle was located in the streets, was fought in the streets of Philadelphia because, quiet as it's kept, there were as many people for slavery as against slavery in Philadelphia. We used to talk about Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love, but prominent Philadelphians had ties to Southern banks and industries and business. So
they were profiting off of it.
Yeah, they were profiting of it, and they had vested interests, obviously, in maintaining slavery.
So wait a minute. Okay, so you said the scrapbooks were from 1870 to 1902 or 1900. And so they still had information. That's after the period of enslavement, but they still had information about the Underground Railroad?
Good catch. So I mentioned that there were books, rare books, right? One of the rare books was written in 1871 by William Still, who many consider to be, they call him the father or the general of the Underground Railroad. Yeah. He was a mover and shaker. So he was a member of this American Negro Historical Society, and he wrote the now popular book, the seminal book on Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad. Still was not he was an intelligent man, to be sure, but he was not a literary man. He was not schooled in literary form and function. And he says so
that too
in his book, and very humble about it. But he talks about the period of slavery leading up to the Civil War. But here's the thing, he couldn't write it until after the North had won the Civil War. And you remember how I talked to you about the Fugitive Slave Act? Mr. Still, William Still, had to hide. That's a whole story I'm neglecting. But he kept records of all the people that he helped. Records, correspondence, Ife left Baltimore. She stayed over in Wilmington, and she landed in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He
Mhm.
had the experience of a family reunion that inspired him to do it because he found his long lost family.
Yeah.
So he committed very early on, that he was going to keep these records as a way of getting families reunited who had been separated through slavery. So, come the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, all the stuff that he had amassed, all that rich, irreplaceable information, he had a command decision to make. Does he burn it
Uh-huh.
or does he preserve it? Because what they offered was incriminating information. If
Right.
you were a helper, he couldn't put his helpers in jeopardy. So he came up with the clever idea to bury him. So he buried that collection, his collection, in a cemetery until the heat was off and until they won the Civil War. And then he pulled them back out of the grave and wrote his book.
I
It's one
love
of the
our
most
people.
one of the most authentic books on Black history you ever want to get. I mean, talk about a primary source material. I mean, yeah,
Wow. Oh man, I can't tell you how much I love our people because when
I'm telling you, it's
creative genius, because I'm sitting up here like, oh my gosh, if he's writing this stuff down, then what
right.
did
He
they
had to make a command decision. Like, do I burn it? What do I do?
and
So
bury it
you
in the
can,
cemetery because you know they ain't going up in there. So
right. So,
put it in the cemetery.
yeah.
Wow.
So that's how we know so much about pre 1870 William Still's book mainly.
Got
And
it.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and his story is amazing because although he wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, although he wasn't enslaved, his brother was enslaved, and
His,
he accidentally found his brother, right? Or his brother accidentally found him. I don't know how you want to describe it.
I'll summarize it real quick. He did have a brother. The brother was sold. They were raised in the Maryland Eastern Shore. The brother was sold and sent deep south to
Hmm.
Alabama. He ultimately paid for his freedom, and he came north looking for his parents and his siblings. And he was told that if you go to Philadelphia, the rest of them were told, if you go to Philadelphia, look up this man named William Still. He'll take care of you.
Hmm.
So that he did. He had a late evening meal with William Still, and he started talking about his experience as a slave. And lo and behold, he finds out that the guy he's talking about is his long lost brother. And how does he know that? Because the mother had this distinguishing scar on her face, and he described it. So thereafter, he was totally radicalized. His whole life was devoted to the abolition of slavery and record keeping because he wanted to have other families have the same pure joy that he had in reconnecting with his family.
Finding it, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I think that's the part that stood out to me when he was saying that he knew that the man he was talking to was his brother because his mother had that distinct mark on her face, and
yeah.
it's like there's nobody else that it could have been. So
No.
that this is my long lost brother. So wow, that
And
they
I'll tell you something else. I've never participated or witnessed it, but I'm told from relatively believable sources that there's an annual reenactment of the Still family reunion in New Jersey. They
oh,
talk about that. Yes, it's a big deal.
wow.
Yeah.
So if you have just joined us, we are talking to my colleague, Dr. excuse me, Dr. Sulayman Clark. He is talking about his book, The Friends of Freedom, and we are just going through all the things that he discovered and that he's written in this book. It's a novel of historical fiction that really talks about enslaved Africans and the Underground Railroad and all the people that were ensuring to help folks that were moving from enslavement to freedom. Dr. Clark, well, actually, I want to say if you have questions for Dr. Clark, definitely put those in the chat so we
Well,
can.
yeah, sure.
There's one thing that I kind of wanted to shift to now. So we've got William Still down. Let's talk a little bit more about Philadelphia because I think sometimes people know, but I don't think they're really clear about how integral Philadelphia was to the Underground Railroad. Can you talk to us a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Yeah. Philadelphia was an interesting place. Like most major cities in the North, like New York and Boston, etc., they had goodly number of free people of color, if you will, who never bore slavery, or they were fugitives who made their way and made homes in the North. And in selected cities in the South, you had little pockets of so-called free people of color, but they were largely educated folks, well-grounded folks whose family lineages go back before the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny when we look at African American history, we talk about enslavement moving towards freedom. But in the case of free people of color, particularly in Philadelphia, they were free
Mm-hmm.
and had their rights systematically, gradually
Mm-hmm.
taken away from them. Principal amongst them was the right to vote. Prior to 1837, they could vote in the state of Pennsylvania. But
Really?
come 1837, they said, nah, we don't think that's such a good
I
deal.
never knew that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Oh,
free people of color communities go back to Richard Allen in the late 1790s with the formation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
no, I mean I knew that part because actually, I don't. You and I have never discussed this, but I actually descend one line of my family. The people are free people of color.
Okay. Yeah.
um, so that part I knew about the free people of color. I didn't know that people of African descent could ever vote in the
Oh,
U.S.
absolutely. I talk about that somewhere in the book. But I have a friend who's working on a book about black colleges, and he's talking about one phase of their existence where they focused exclusively on literacy,
Mm-hmm.
right on the heels of the Civil War.
Right.
And I was saying to him that narrative doesn't fit free people of color who were
Mm-hmm.
quite literate. Matter of fact, if you couldn't read the scripture, you were not a literate man or woman. So it's a different. It goes beyond literacy. And what I try to say in the article I share with you was that these people like Still and Dorsey and them, they had a very specific reason for doing all that collecting. They didn't collect Black history like you collect stamps or coins or whatever. They had a deeper, more far-reaching motivation in mind. And I'm going to read for you, if I could,
Sure.
something that speaks to that point. So the president of the organization, William Adger, in 1902, writes the purpose of their collecting. He says, "We want the newspapers, the churches, and the parents to tell their children what our past condition was and about those dear people who are dead and gone, of the sacrifices they made on our behalf and the grand opportunities we are now offered." He's writing in 1902 when there were limited freedoms, but he thought it was important that young people take advantage of the limited freedoms they had and that they remember that they stand on the shoulders of others.
Mm-hmm.
So this was not about some academic. They were not academics. What they were trying to do, their vision was one of cultural transmission, historical transmission. And what I say in my article is the creation of a counter narrative, if you will, to Black inferiority. These guys, when they formed the organization, they're in their 80s and 90s, most of them. And those old eyes had seen a lot. They saw the proliferation of slavery. They saw a bloody civil war. They saw a short-lived Reconstruction period, followed by decades of Jim Crow segregation in the North as well in the South. And they did not want future generations to be burdened by that negative Black inferiority complex, if you will. So
Right.
all their history had to do with celebrating Black achievement, okay, because they wanted to pass that on. That they thought that that was the substance, the spiritual food that young people needed. This was not about nostalgia or romanticism or things like this. Like this is the stuff young folks need to know, so that they could see their progression and their education in a broader context, in a deeper context of an ongoing intergenerational struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't want them to be unarmed. So that's what all this history was about, this recording, if you will.
And so actually what you're talking about, so you said they're not academics, and kind of like through our Western training and our doctoral programs, we think of academics really from this European lens. And what you're describing is no, they were academics. They
No,
understood the importance of history. They understood that history was an entryway to psychological liberation for our people.
right. And they're not to hate at all. There are some good books about the Underground Railroad. It's a beautiful book I read about Octavius Cato, but they were written by European scholars.
Mhm.
What I'm trying to do is keep faith with the psychology and motivation of the people that I'm writing about.
Mhm.
I think that's what they're trying to pass on, this intangible uh, cultural identification, if you will. And if you miss that, you miss the whole point
Right.
of their preserving history,
Right.
right?
And what you're talking about is that importance of us speaking, writing about us, for us, and it be our voices. Because if you have someone outside of a community, yes, they can write about it, but they don't have the lived experience of the
Right.
community, and so they're going to write things from a different perspective. I think even just going to that point that you were saying is that if you have this focus of HBCUs doing this very important work of making sure that people of African descent are literate. But then if you just focus on that, then you skip all of these free people that were already literate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And again, it goes back to you reading that first paragraph, that introductory paragraph from chapter one.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted people to identify with them because the people that I'm writing about, think about it this way: slavery during that period was an immutable fact of life.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going to enslave in perpetuity men, women, and children till the end of time.
Yes.
Till
Not
the
me.
end.
Don't put me in that.
I didn't say you had anything to do with it. No, I didn't say that. But if you had a problem with that, too bad, so sad. So just think about that. You had academics, you had clergymen from their pulpits say this was the will of God. Slavery reflected the natural order. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So these people had to have a level of hope and a level of faith that allowed them to transcend what sociologists call the tyranny of the present.
Mm-hmm.
Because how are we getting out of this? Our fates are sealed. How are we going to defeat this multi-headed monster that's so firmly entrenched in our national economy, this thing called slavery? And they did it through various means. I mean, that is the point of the story. Like, that's why I'm so glad you identify with the rains, the fact that there are very rarely periods of unbroken sunshine. Like,
Yes.
they knew a little something about rain. Yeah,
They knew a lot about it. Yes, yes, yes.
yeah.
I want to shift. And okay, so we have folks that are watching. I want to challenge everyone that's watching. Good afternoon. My guest today is Dr. Sulayman Clark. We're talking about his book, The Friends of Freedom. And I want to talk about Henry Box Brown. So I'm wondering how many people that are listening have ever heard of Henry Box Brown. Do me a favor and put it in the chat. Who is Henry Box Brown? You can just do like a quick little thing about Henry Box Brown. As you are doing that, I want to read the intro to chapter 23. This is something that was actually written by Henry Box Brown himself.
Yes.
I entered the world a slave in the midst of a country whose most honored writings declare that all men have a right to liberty. Tyrants, remorseless, destitute of religion and every principle of humanity, stood by the couch of my mother as I entered into the world. Before I had done anything to forfeit my right to liberty, and while my soul was yet undefiled by the commission of an actual sin, stretched forth their bloody arms and branded me with the mark of bondage. And by such means, I became their own property.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he's calling people out. And so you said it. And I just really need to highlight this. Part of what I think that sometimes we may struggle with around enslavement is
Mm-hmm.
identifying how many people called themselves religious and
Yeah.
enslaved people
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
justified enslavement, who preach from their pulpits that African people had committed sin, were born in sin, and so they should be enslaved.
Sure.
And if you, I'm sure you've gone to the enslavement dungeons um,
Mm-hmm.
on the continent, and
Sure.
where you can see those churches right in
Yeah.
the middle of those slave dungeons.
Yeah. Well, back to Henry Box Brown. He's slowly but surely made his way into our history books.
Yeah.
Did we get responses from how many people who
Let me see.
know
Okay,
his
on
story?
the right hand side, if you see the comments, Dr. Corey Claiborne says, "Okay, so you got the smart people on here. Of course they know." And Dr. Monique Earl Lewis. Okay, so she said he was a person who shifted himself in a box to freedom, thus the name. And then Dr. Earl Lewis said, self-determined black man who claimed his freedom upside down in a wooden box, says a lot. And then M. Chi says Henry Box Brown was an enslaved man from VA that escaped to freedom in a wooden box. He made his way to Philadelphia.
Okay, so I would say to you that's only half the story.
Okay.
The
Educate
thing that
us, teach us.
yeah, it's really half the story. And if you read my book, you'll appreciate why I say what I say.
Okay.
Henry Box Brown was a different kind of slave. He was working as an adult. He's a slave in Richmond. And what happened to him was it was not necessarily the brutal treatment, the whipping and the torture that most of the slaves encountered. He seemed to be somewhat favored. But where he wasn't favored was they sold his wife and children out from under him.
Mm.
And he was promised, yeah, for what that's worth, right, that
Mm.
they would never be separated. And he tells the story that they went up back on their word. They sold his wife and children. I guess they fetched him a good price. And him trailing the chain gang a certain distance because feeling powerless, like there's nothing he could do to rescue his family. So having conceded that, he comes back home and he wants to go north. He don't want anything to do with slavery. So he comes up with this idea that he's going to be shipped in this wooden crate for a trip that takes about 23 hours from Richmond to Philadelphia. And it's true. Somewhere along the train ride, the crate turns upside down. So he's right side up. And they say when he opened up the box, he was so wet, it was as if he swam his way, but he made it. He had a drill for extra air holes, and the drill broke out. Everything that could happen wrong happened wrong. So that's his story. But when I say it's half the story, does anybody think about, well, who put him in the box?
That's what I was just thinking. Who put him in the box? Who got him out the box?
Who put him in? So let's talk about who put him in.
Uh-huh.
The person who put him in was a white guy, Samuel Smith, who was a friend of the slave, if you will. And he's the one who arranged for the shipping. Reason why that's half the story is that Samuel Smith was ultimately caught helping other slaves do the exact same thing. So they caught him and they had to make an example out of him, and they sentenced him to 4 years in jail. They even hired some inmates to kill him. So he took some stab wounds to the chest, but he lived to tell the story. Wow. So my argument is you can't tell the story of Henry Box Brown without telling the story of Samuel Smith. And the way when I talk to students, I put it this way. Henry Box Brown was a slave, so he took his chances. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain by trying to get his freedom. On the contrary, in contrast, Samuel Smith had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Remember, this is the Fugitive Slave Act. Mm-hmm. If we catch you, your goose is cooked. Mm-hmm. And he helped them anyway. So that's what my book tries to say. These so-called friends of freedom came in all colors and shapes. Mm-hmm. And they sacrificed, many of them, life and limb to oppose this multi-headed monster called slavery.
Okay, Dr. Clark, though, who was the box shipped to?
Take a guess. In Philadelphia, who's there to open up the box?
Still, but
William and his crew.
Ow!
The Anti-Slavery Society. They were mainly Quakers who they were there, and they took him out of the box and set him up, and he went on about his merry way.
Did you ever run across like people that got caught? I mean, I know these kind of stories, but were there other folks that I'm thinking that people would have known about William Still and been watching his house. That's why I'm like, how could a box go?
Well, that was the thing. These guys, and you have to remember, there were no police forces, no protections. Mobocracy ruled. So William Still has an office called the Anti-Slavery Society office, no shame in their game. They just said, well,
Okay.
this is what we're about. You be about what you about. We be about this. Um, but where I thought you were headed was that a lot of these slaves not make it, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
And one of the things that doesn't get enough attention when we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act is if I caught you. This is the whole premise of the book by Mr. Samuel Northrop. I think it's Samuel Northrop. 12 Years a Slave.
Yes.
Right. He's a free person of color. He gets kidnapped, yes, and
Hmm.
taken down south into slavery. Well, that's what happened all over Philadelphia because in addition to finding those who help slaves, we reward those who capture them. So if I captured you and I said, "Oh, I got me a slave,"
Hmm.
uh, they would just muzzle you and wish you down across the Mason-Dixon line. So kidnapping in and around Philadelphia was rampant because you could get paid. And if you were poor and destitute, you had black and white people who would snitch on you. So, Ife up there on the third house on the right, she don't look like she belongs here. So,
I'll be the main one.
so, so there was that. There was that kind of treachery that they rewarded, and you didn't have a whole lot of legal backup. If I declared you a slave, it's your burden of proof is on you to say how you're not a slave.
Yeah.
In North's case, I mean, he was not a slave. He had been a free guy, but none of that mattered because under the blanket of Fugitive Slave Act, they could do all kind of atrocities, and kidnapping was legitimized, if you will.
Yeah. Dr. Claiborne is making the point. I mean, I definitely had heard this is that you would have these kind of bounty hunters that would go and just kidnap folks and then ship them down south. And so, I mean, it wasn't uncommon that people, even if they had not run away, these would be free people
Right.
that would be enslaved. And you had all kinds of like shady stuff. I mean, this is outside of Philadelphia, but if we look at New York and look at Sojourner Truth, we know that happened with her son, where he was supposed to be freed, and then dude sold her son down south. I think the interesting piece about her story is that she went to court and miraculously won.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it had a kind of a different take on that story. But we know that that was something that was like common and occurring where people just weren't safe.
Yeah.
I want to jump. I know that we have like 7 more minutes left. I can't believe.
Oh wow, the time went fast.
Yeah, you got to talk about Jim Brown. Oh, Jim Brown. Lord, I said Jim Brown. I didn't mean Jim Brown.
Okay.
Scratch that.
You sure we can talk about Jim Brown if you want.
Another time. That's
Another
when you
time.
stop watching a Night in Miami. That's all I'm
Okay.
saying.
Different story. Okay. All right.
Talk
Different book, different story. Okay.
a little bit about John Brown and how he shows up in your book.
Good old John Brown. You know, history judges him harshly, I think, depending on who you're talking to. But by and large, the overall depiction is that he was a madman.
That's just
But
because he was revolutionary. He
because he
wasn't.
was revolutionary. And, you know, people don't put their lives on the line for slaves. So they say he was, mentally speaking, very suspect. But if you look at his biography, he was anti-slavery for a very long time. He just took it to the next level. I
Mhm.
mean, he murdered people who were slaves. You know that whole story, is his various raids. That's another story. But prior to the, I'm glad you raised him. Prior to his raid, he was staunchly abolitionist, anti-slavery, and did various and sundry things. Prior to the raid, he came to Philadelphia and he met with abolitionists. He went up to Boston and met with the abolitionists up there, Ralph Waldo Emerson and people like that. So
Mhm.
there was this network who were known to one another.
Right.
Well, he had been plotting this for a long while. And the idea was they were going to take over, you know, the story, this
Mhm.
arsenal in West Virginia and free the slaves. And they were going to nationwide have this nationwide, what do you want to call it? Revolution, armed revolution against slavery. And of course, it failed. he got tried and hung
Mhm.
and died totally unrepentant. And I talk about this in the book. And then he says, if I had intervened, for white people as I did for blacks, you all would be declaring me a saint. You'd be hoisting me on your shoulders. But because I did it for the benefit of the scorned black folks, I'm a villain. I'm a demon, if you will. But always, you have to tell the full story. What my book touches upon is some of the men who went down with him. He got arrested. A couple of his sons, I believe, were hung for their trials. Few got away. And how did they get away? With the aid of Mr. Still and the abolitionists. So not all the men were hung.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And one of the guys I want to introduce you to in the book, you'll see, is Robert Copeland. Name that. I'd be interested to know how many people know about Copeland.
Yeah.
He was one of the younger members of the Army, of the John Brown Army, who was college educated. He had graduated from, he may not have graduated, but he attended Oberlin College. And at his trial, the judge was saying, this is one of the few people that I really feel bad that I'm going to have to kill, because he's such an morally upstanding man. He's articulate. He pled his case. And he writes the most beautiful, elegant letter to his parents as he prepares for the gallows. And I'll paraphrase it for you, but please read the book and please read about Copeland's last letter. And he talks about that. Don't grieve for me, because men and women far better than me have gone this same way. Take care of yourselves, love one another, and I'll see you on the other side. It's like fearless. It's like he knew that what he was doing was right.
Mm-hmm.
So he had no remorse. And he said, other people have died for this cause. And I want young readers to know his name as much as they know John Brown. Because those men had families. They had lives too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we can say, I kind of pull in, put my hat on as a psychologist, is that in the pursuit of freedom, in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of justice in this country, people are often labeled as insane. So that is one of the issues with mental health, and particularly for our people, around mental health and the problems with the mental health system, is if you are silent and smiling and shucking and jiving while somebody has their foot on your neck, then you're okay. If you're
Okay.
speaking out about it,
You're well adjusted.
you're
Yeah.
well adjusted. And you start to see this conversation about mental instability
Yeah.
around people that are refusing to be oppressed.
Yeah.
And it tends to be around women and tends to be around people of color, and then everybody else is like, oh, they're having a bad day. Or
It was a bad day. Yeah.
if you go and you're a seditious rioter who attempts to coup on the United States government, then you're just trying to stand up for your rights and you're patriotic.
Yeah.
So
And I'll say this about John Brown. I think most of the historians would agree with this. Everybody talked about his failed raid, but it did accomplish one thing. It really strengthened the polarization between the North and the South and brought this issue of slavery to a head. So when I think about the decade of the 1850s leading up to the run-up of the Civil War, that was a critical 10-year period.
yeah.
And there were people on the abolitionist camp. America's divided into these two camps.
Mm-hmm.
We the people camp and slavery camp.
Yeah.
And they kept the fight against slavery alive and well. And they pushed it to a point where we had to have this costly and bloody Civil War. But they never let the fire die down.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of John Brown's greatest accomplishments. Like he said, no, this is not going to end well for America. There will be bloodshed. And yes, lo and behold, there was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Dr. Sulayman Clark, we are at the end of our hour. That
Wow, went fast.
1 hour went by so fast. It
Yeah.
was amazing talking about this book. If you could leave us with, I'm thinking of one woman. So we named Harriet Tubman. Is there another woman that stands out for you? Another Black woman that stands out specifically for you?
There is, and I want everybody to please read this book when you can.
Yes.
It should be out on Apple iBooks next week. Friends of Freedom. One of the persons that I knew nothing about, literally nothing, was a woman, and I'd be interested in how many of you folks heard of her, Fanny Jackson Coppin.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
so I'm just saying that.
she,
Other folks, if you, I see a couple people are still listening. Fanny Jackson
yeah,
Coffin, have you heard of her? Yeah, definitely.
yeah. Um, who was a Oberlin graduate, came to Philadelphia, and stayed at the Institute for Colored Youth for 38 years, if you can believe it. Institute for Colored Youth is the forerunner of Cheney University, which
Oh,
is largely considered the oldest HBCU. It's
well,
chartered
I
in
ain't gonna get into that between you and Lincoln. Okay, so go back in.
another story, another time.
I'm not
But,
getting it.
but this is a woman literally who gave her very life to
Mhm.
the pursuit of Black higher education, who's scarcely gets a mention. There's a school in Baltimore named after her, but other than that, um, I want young women to identify and learn as much as they can about Fanny Jackson Cobbin, extraordinary soul.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Can I show the book, or is this cover the one you gave
That's
me?
it. Which
Okay.
one do you have?
Okay. I have this
That's
one.
it. That's what it
Okay.
looks like. Yeah.
So this is Dr. Clark's book, The Friends of Freedom. And like you said, it will be on Apple. Is it was it
Apple iBooks. Mm-hmm.
iBooks,
Yeah.
and you can get this next week.
Yep.
I'm telling you that this was amazing. I opened it up. Well, he sent me the first 2 chapters, and I was like, wait a minute, I need the rest. He's gonna send me 2 chapters. Had my heart pounding. I was like, well, what's happening here? So I got the rest of the book.
Good. Good.
So definitely pick up the book. We can go back, Dr. Clark, if you all share the link with us. We can go back and put the link in. So if people see this video later on, then they can click on the link and go directly to the book. So
Sounds good.
definitely purchase this book. One thing we didn't say
What's that?
is, who'd you write this book for? We didn't talk about that.
The dedication? Is that what you're saying?
No, no,
Or
no.
the audiences?
Audience.
Far and away, I wrote it for high school students. Grades 10 to 12 was my thought.
Okay.
Because I wanted the kind of book that I wished I was around when I was a young man. Secondly, I wrote it for college students, particularly those in the early years, freshman, sophomore, because I think it's a wonderful gateway book that really stimulates lifelong learning in the area of African American studies. And then thirdly, general audiences, because I think, again, these prevailing myths about Black passivity have to be debunked with historical evidence. And particularly if we're going to learn from the history and apply it to what's going on today.
Right.
Those would be the 3 sections, if you will, of an audience that I'm trying to reach.
Perfect. Nita Robinson is asking, is there a link? Do you all have the link already for the book?
Yeah, I can send that to you.
Okay. So
Yeah,
Nita,
if you don't mind sharing it, yeah.
I'll get the link from Dr. Clark, and then I will put the book, the link in. So if you just come back to our page later on, then the link will be there later today.
Sounds
And
good.
click on that link. Again, Dr. Clark, thank you so much for.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah. So everyone, thank you for hanging out with us on this Friday. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I'm speaking with my colleague, Dr. Sulayman Clark, about his book, The Friends of Freedom. It is out on Apple iBooks next week. So make sure that you go to Apple iBooks so you can come back to us and be able to click this link and go directly to the book. Every single Friday at 12 o'clock, I am here talking about African-centered psychology, culture, spirituality, everything that has to do with our people and our healing and how we're going to get free. So come back and hang out with me. Take care.
Bye now.